But let's go first of all to Arabella Skinner, Director of Us for Them, because this huge crime wave, Arabella, very good morning to you, which is being predicted, I think perhaps has already started, hasn't it?
Well, I think what's really shocking about this, Mike, is not the information about the numbers going up. We've talked about this loads of times. Yeah. These numbers just keep moving up. And it's been predicted consistently since 2020 onwards that any children out of school are going to lose the skills and the ability and therefore probably end up in these kind of issues, particularly around county lines and the other areas. For me, the really shocking element is that Gillian Keegan is apparently just about to begin an attendance drive. What are we doing? It's 3 years from this problem being raised. And she says she's going to help schools confront children about why they're not in school.
Right.
I'm not sure confronting these children are necessarily going to help them work out why they're not there and support them. We need to put the elements in place to get children back into school because, every year these numbers go up and up and up. Last year we were talking, sort of 800,000 children missing 10% of school. We're now talking 1.7 million children missing 10%.
It's an awful lot of kids, isn't it?
It's shocking.
Presumably the other problem, Arabella, as well, is that some of these kids are no longer kids because, if it was, say, if they were 15 or 16 when the pandemic started and lockdown started, they're now over 18 and God knows where they are.
Yeah, these numbers are only including children who are actually in school at the moment. Right. So all those kids who are now 19, 20, they're not being included in these numbers, and they would have been children that got behind and have missed out. The Children Commissioner has been shouting about this for the last couple of years, and she's looked at a couple of specific areas that are stopping kids getting into school. One is obviously mental health. Yeah. We know that's a real problem, particularly social media and teenage girls. Right. Issues around young carers who are supporting SEND, but more importantly, once you get behind, it's very, very hard to catch up. And if you got behind during the pandemic and you carried on getting behind, each time you go back in, it's harder and it's harder to catch up. We know the National Tutoring Programme was a bit of a failure. They didn't even spend all the money they put in there because they made it so restrictive for schools to be able to actually support children. We know that SEND, we know that speech and language, there's a very big interaction between our prison community and those with speech and language issues. Right. We need to be heavily supporting that. But also, they say ministers have committed to support 1,700 children with mentoring programmes. We've got 125,000 children we know of that are missing 50% of school. What's 1% going to do for those children?
Exactly right. And what about the school's role in all of this? Because I don't know whether they do it anymore, but there used to be such a thing as sort of a truant officer. If you weren't at school, somebody would come to the house to see why and what was actually going on. Do they even do that anymore?
It varies from school to school, but yes, they do. A lot of schools have incredibly supportive people who are going in and going out to schools. I mean, I know personally of senior leadership teams who, during the pandemic, went out to every vulnerable child to check they were okay and keep going. But they have so much going on, a lot of these teachers, in what they're trying to pick up and what they're trying to do. And the sheer just not having enough numbers of support. But it's one thing to go in and find out where these children are, and this is where the language of confronting comes in. But just confronting and getting a kid into school isn't necessarily going to solve the problem if they're 3 years down the line and it's a mental health issue, it's an anxiety issue. It's I'm actually a year 10 child with the ability of a year 6 child. Right. It's all the other things we need to put in place to support these children who we've let down.
And are they presumably falling through the cracks in all other areas of their lives as well, so that they might be, troubled at home, they might be abused at home, they might be vulnerable in other sorts of ways, they might be taking drugs, they might have already left the house, they might be wandering the streets. I mean, anything's possible.
The Children's Commissioner work shows that actually this is much more likely for vulnerable children. However, we do know that school avoidance, it has gone across the board in a way that it never did. It was an occasional thing. Right. When my kids were younger, I knew 1 or 2 kids that school avoided, but now I know huge numbers of children who have these issues. But it is the most vulnerable children in our society who are going to end up being excluded and end up in the criminal justice system.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly know just from talking to my own kids that they know kids at their schools who haven't been there for, say, a year. And nobody knows why, or at least the kids that don't know why, they're not told. But they don't understand how somebody can get away with it, basically.
Well, I think sometimes they turn up in the morning and they can't go. There are some people who genuinely have a serious anxiety issue. They can't cope with it because they're scared, because they've been taught school's quite a scary place.
Right.
I think we also have to reflect on the fact that we've had 3 years of sheer disruption. So we obviously had school closures, which the government still keep talking about the fact that schools weren't closed. Well, for 98% of the population, schools were closed. But then we had schools being open, but bubbles, and you were constantly being sent home. And when we've actually had schools open, we've had strikes. So we've had children unable to, not knowing whether they're going into school the next day or a week later. So it's very hard to convince children that education is important if we don't give them consistency of education.
No, exactly. And I mean, the other thing I don't think that's helping the school situation overall is the strikes that have happened in the most recent times, because I know for a fact that kids who see people going on strike will say, well, if you're not going to turn up for work, then I'm not going to bother turning up for school.
Absolutely. Regardless of the rights and wrongs of the strike, it sends a message that shutting down school is acceptable and not being in school is acceptable. And we have to remember, it's not just the teacher strikes. Lots of children, and mine in particular, have been affected by the railway strikes. How can they actually get into school when there's no public transport to get them there? So it has made the uncertainty. Our children have been living with an uncertainty of education, and they don't get up each week and assume that they're going to be in school this week.
No, and that is the problem. And also, of course, I know we haven't mentioned the COVID inquiry yet, but the COVID inquiry still looms over all of this like a sort of dark cloud, unfortunately, because what they're not doing is looking into the school situation.
You're absolutely right, Mike. And there's 2 key things. So they've now announced their 6th module, which is going to have hearings in spring 2025, so don't hold your breath. That isn't even children. So by the time we get to children, we're probably talking 2026, 2027.
No.
Every child in the education system will have grown up. And even more telling is they're running this listening programme, the Every Story Matters. Well, I'm afraid if you're under 18, your story doesn't matter because they're not letting under 18s contribute.
Yes, that's a very good point. Also, it's a ludicrous slogan now, because every story doesn't actually matter, because if you have every bleeding story, you'll be there till the end of the world, basically, and you'll still be doing the COVID inquiry in 100 years' time. It's why we have editors of newspapers and why we have producers of radio shows and TV shows. Otherwise, they'd never stop. It's this kind of ludicrous notion that everything's important. Some things are more important than other things. That's the whole point of the inquiry.
Absolutely, and you're expecting them to make their judgment to do it. And in this case in particular, I don't think we can rely on the inquiry to actually come up with any practical solutions, because the children are going to be too old. Hopefully they will actually look at the impact of it and look at the question of, was the risk and benefit and analysed at all? We know it wasn't. But what we need, instead of the government making comments about, we're going to do an attendance drive, they actually need to invest in proper mentoring for these kids, supporting these children and delivering serious action.
Yeah, absolutely right. Arabella, great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Arabella Skinner, Director, Us for Them, on the news of a terrible survey, or a study, by the way, that's been done. There's a generation of ghost children who have basically given up on school and are now at risk of turning to crime. Up to 9,000 more young offenders, including 2,000 violent criminals, could be on Britain's streets by 2027.